Photosynthesis is the conversion of light energy into chemical energy. It's also the synthesis of organic materials, for example, glucose, using light energy. So you use glucose. No, not it's a synthesis. You don't use glucose. You make glucose by using light energy and carbon dioxide. And I've now made over here two nice green boxes. Green because plants are green. And there are two parts to photosynthesis, and it's the one is called the light-dependent reaction. That's this one over here. I abbreviate this with a light LDR, light-dependent reaction. So I'm going to write this down in here. That's the light-dependent reaction. And then there is also the light-independent reaction, and I call this the light-independent reaction. But if you ever have an exam, don't abbreviate it with LDR and LIR, but actually write it out, because nobody understands what it means otherwise. And I just realized that I forgot to give you the overall formula of photosynthesis, so I will do this right now. I will write down over here. You need 6 carbon dioxide, 6 CO2, plus 6 molecules of water, 6 H2O. And what do you produce at the end? You produce at the end 6 oxygen molecules plus C6H12O6, which is my glucose. And basically, I've written this. What do you need else? What else do you need? Light. I forgot. Light energy, of course, very important. Basically, this is I've drawn this as one chemical reaction over here, but in reality, it's a pretty complicated process, and I'm splitting it up into the light-dependent and the light-independent reaction. Okay, so that is basically the point of this this slide over here. So let's start off with the light-dependent reaction. What does the light-dependent reaction need? Well, probably light. So why don't I just write this down here? You need sunlight. Or it doesn't have to be sunlight, but the wavelengths have to be correct. But at least I'm adding some light here. And this is the energy I'm adding. And now the question is, what does the plant do with that light? It uses the light to split water. So the splitting of water occurs here. The splitting of water. And this has a nice name. It's called photolysis. Photo means light. Photo, and lysis means splitting. And when we split, if we split water, we also need water. So H2O. That is the, basically, and I've now basically got my light over here. I've got my water also accounted for. And when you split the water, into what do you split the water? The water is split into electrons, and I abbreviate the electrons with E minus, and hydrogens, H plus, and also oxygens. Okay, so you have to have essentially 2 H plus, and then oxygen 1/2 molecule of O2. If you don't let this 1/2 confuse you over here. Because I only have 1 oxygen in water. Okay, you don't like that, then we do the following. We say 4 electrons, 4 E minus, plus 4 H plus, plus a molecule of O2. Okay, maybe this kind of confuses you less. So basically we have now oxygen over here. Now what happens to this oxygen? This oxygen is released, O2, and that's the oxygen that the plants produce, and that's the one over here. So we also have accounted for this one. Occasionally they have a multiple choice question, I remember, and they ask where does the oxygen come from that plants produce, and one possibility was carbon dioxide. So many people thought, cool, there's an O2 in the carbon dioxide over here, and so it must come from carbon dioxide. But that's wrong. The oxygen that plants produce essentially comes from the splitting of water. So the question is now, what happens to these electrons? These electrons over here. These electrons over here, they end up in a molecule called NADPH. Standard level people don't have to worry about that so much, but essentially these electrons over here, they will be passed on. Electrons. Electrons. They have high energy electrons are passed on to the light independent reaction via, and how are they carried? They're carried by NADPH You don't have to worry about this so much. If you wonder what NADPH stands for, it sounds kind of cool. Nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, and it's reduced. It's a nice little tongue twister. And the light-dependent reaction also produces ATP, and this probably you already know. ATP is a molecule that carries also energy. So what's the whole point of this light-dependent reaction? Essentially, what we've done is the following: we converted light energy into a form that the cell can use, namely into a chemical energy. Chemical energy. My handwriting is bad, but you understand that this should be chemical energy, and this chemical energy is ATP, and also high energy electrons. Okay, high energy electrons. And these high energy electrons, of course, also come from the water. So that's basically what happens in a light-dependent reaction. And now we move on to the light-independent reaction. And you see that we still have to deal with the carbon dioxide over here, and we have to make some glucose. The light-independent reaction can also be called the Calvin cycle, because a guy called Melvin Calvin discovered it. And you can also call the light-independent reaction carbon fixation. There's an old term, some folks in the past called it the dark reaction, but you should not use that, because essentially the light-dependent reaction indirectly also depends on light, because it depends on the ATP and the electrons, and they can only be formed if there's enough light present. So the dark reaction is not really a good way of actually naming it. So the light-independent reaction is actually much better. So and in the light-independent reaction, what do we need? We need CO2. So I'm adding the CO2 over here. So the plants take up CO2. Then the CO2 and the ATP and the electrons basically are joined together to make glucose, C6H12O6. So we have accounted for the carbon dioxide, and we've accounted for the glucose. And this whole process takes place in the chloroplast of plant cells. And this was already the overview over photosynthesis. You might now wonder, I'm just adding this now, we have the glucose over here. Now, what happens to the glucose? Well, the glucose can now be used for cell respiration. The glucose can be stored in the form of starch. Starch storage. Remember that starch are long chains of glucose molecules, and the plant actually converts this to starch to store it. And the last thing is we can use the glucose, or the plant can use the glucose to make cellulose for the cell wall. Cellulose for cell wall. Cell wall. Okay, so that is basically what you why the plant needs the glucose. Okay, so you see it's pretty important. It has many different uses as well. But ultimately, what the foil was about is essentially the light dependent and the independent reaction, and the overall process of photosynthesis. Okay, so if you are, my advice is the following: is that you study these boxes, but that you also write down a summary in English to describe the whole process. And then you have 2 paragraphs or 2 short paragraphs, one about the light dependent and one about the light independent reaction. And then you essentially explain what happens in these 2 reactions. Okay, and that's already it.